Thank you very much indeed, and to the EPA and organisers for the opportunity to come and talk about some of those insights. So, as mentioned, we've recently produced EPA, the Irish Climate Change Assessment Report, the first of its kind for Ireland, where a number of scientists from across Ireland, interested in different aspects of climate change, came together to produce 4 volumes. A volume looking at the science of climate change, Volume 1. Second volume looking at how we realise a climate-neutral Ireland by mid-century. Volume 3 looking at how we can be prepared for Ireland's future climate, thinking about the context of adaptation, but also the impacts that we're likely to experience, and the kinds of changes and ramping up that we need to do in order to realise a climate-resilient Ireland. A novel addition indeed was Volume 4, which is about realising the benefits of transition and transformation. This is a major undertaking over the course of 3 years. I need to recognise all the different authors. Some of them are in the room. 22 of us from across 5 different higher education institutes. We together reviewed something in the order of 2,500 conservatively research papers and policy papers for inclusion, so a truly interdisciplinary endeavour. I'd also like to recognise the role that the EPA and stakeholder groups played in this in terms of providing feedback on early drafts, looking at key messages, and also international expert reviewers who very much improved our final product. So a huge body of work, and in about 15 minutes I'm going to give some insights into what we found when it comes to thinking about adaptation to climate change. So this is from Volume 3 of the EPA report. I don't know what's happened to my text, but it's there. So in terms of the summary for policymakers for this volume, we started by asking what is the current state of play on adaptation? Where are we? The second focus we took is what are we adapting to? What are the impacts? And thirdly then, how do we make it to being a climate resilient Ireland by 2050? What are the kinds of things we need to get better at? So in terms of the current state of play on adaptation, we've heard it many times today already, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Climate change is happening. We can now discern the influence of climate change in our long-term meteorological observations. I'll show you an example in a moment. In the occurrence of extreme events. I'll show you an example again from last year. And we need to push on with adaptation. As Laura has said early on in today's conference, the focus has predominantly been on mitigation. It's important to recognise that mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, and adaptation, reducing losses, making the most of opportunities, and the idea of just resilience, it's important to recognise that they are inherently linked. The less successful we are at mitigation, the more adaptation we're going to have to do. But equally important to recognise is that even if we stop greenhouse gas emissions at 0 tomorrow, we still have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. It's not one or the other. We now need to focus on developing both of these policy responses. And in Ireland, I think a key point to recognise is that we're not starting from an ideal position. Adaptation is about working with nature. We're seeing a decline in biodiversity. We're seeing a decline in water quality. It's about working with people to reduce vulnerability. We're seeing problems in terms of increases with cost of living. We're seeing increases in homelessness. We're seeing increases in challenges around the health sector. So things are changing, not just climate, and adaptation is about making sure that we respond within that context, not within a policy vacuum. So I said I'd give some examples of new science since EPA was only published early this year, and even since then we have new science that's showing the evidence of climate change. Earlier this year, in collaboration with Med-Éireann, with Imperial College London and colleagues at Maynooth University, we undertook Ireland's first extreme event attribution study, looking at the floods in Middleton that occurred in October 2023. And from our analysis, we're able to show clearly that climate change played a role in increasing the risk of flooding. Prior to October in 2023, we saw exceptionally wet conditions. July leading up was one of the wettest Julys on record, if not the wettest. And we saw exceptional, extreme, heavy rainfall, 2-day rainfall totals giving rise to these flood events. We can show the influence, particularly in the extreme rainfall conditions that led to this flood, of a climate change signal. Luckily in Middleton at the time, if you can use the word luckily, it was a low tide. Otherwise, this would have been worse. So we now have the science to show the influence, the smoking gun, if you like, of how climate change is increasing risk. Similarly, recently we've published a paper looking at the emergence of a climate change signal in long-term Irish meteorological records. We have some really long records in Ireland for temperature back to the 1870s or thereabouts, rainfall back to the 1850s thereabouts, that have been quality assured, produced by Met Éireann and other researchers, etc. And we were able to ask the question, do we see the emergence of a climate change signal across different temperature and precipitation extremes? That involved some statistics, regressing local scale change onto global mean surface temperature. And what we see is that yes, the signal of climate change has emerged in Irish meteorological variables, particularly in temperature over recent decades. That's a horrible table over here. Just look at the oranges and the reds. These are different seasons, winter, spring, summer, and autumn. These are different temperature extreme indices, and all of the orange boxes across these different stations in Ireland are showing where we see the emergence of a climate change signal in temperature extremes. Particularly in autumn, particularly in summer, and particularly in spring, we can now discern the influence of global mean surface temperature increases on Irish weather records. Last October, thereabouts, I can't remember exactly, I found myself on an episode of Ear to the Ground, standing in fields in southern Wexford where farmers were unable to extract or to harvest the crop. Extremely wet conditions, heavy rainfall events in the autumn of last year, really causing a problem for farmers. Millions in terms of losses. Those problems for farming have continued into the start of this season in terms of trafficability of land, in terms of the ability to get crops in the ground early enough. And again, when we look at rainfall variability and change, we see the climate signal emerging, particularly in these rainfall extremes. These blue triangles for rainfall intensity, they're showing the percent increase per degree increase in global temperature, and we're increasing about the rate we'd expect from physics, 7% per degree increase in global mean temperature. When we look at autumn trends, we can see some big trends, particularly in the southeast of Ireland, where we're seeing these large, significant, persistent increases in rainfall intensity now impacting farming. Not in the future, but now. And some work that we're doing as part of the EPA-funded HydroDare project. HydroDare is detection and attribution in hydrology. We've been asking the question, how are floods in Ireland changing? So the Office of Public Works have these river flow stations across Ireland. They're called the FEMI stations, Flood Estimation Methods in Ireland. These are best quality records across the island. We've been looking at trends in these. This is only from 1980 to present, but these large blue triangles increasing are where we see statistically significant increasing trends in our annual maximum flood. Note the Shannon Basin. So we're able to then use our science and ask, well, are these changes externally or climate driven? Or are they driven by changes within the catchment like land use change? And what we see in most cases, these are just 3 examples from the Shannon, is that simple models using just rainfall variables are able to very closely capture what's happening with those increasing trends in floods. That allows us to conclude that those changes are climate driven, entirely climate driven. And when we place those changes in rainfall extremes in the context of our long records, we see the emergence of a climate change signal. So, where we go to from here in terms of adaptation, it's important to recognise the future that we face is in our hands. As Claire has very ably outlined, you can see very clearly the future world that we face in terms of temperature depends on the emissions that we make over the course of the coming decades. But what is clear is that no matter our choice, whether it's the early action world or a late action world, it's still very different than today. We need to adapt. So in Ireland, we are building the foundations for adaptation. We have local adaptation plans. We have the next iteration of sectoral adaptation plans. We have all you people in the room. We have the networks. We have the science. But we need to see a step change in terms of our ambition and urgency around adaptation. We can see the impacts of recent extreme events. We are highly exposed to climate change across multiple sectors, as I'll talk about in a moment. But we're also, as an island nation, one of the most open economies in the world, very much exposed to changes that are happening across the globe. Not just climate change here in Ireland, but climate change in other parts of the world, or what we might call transboundary climate risks. So we need to move towards all medium and long-term planning having climate change adaptation embedded. And we need to move towards better joined-up thinking, from the governor of the central bank, talking to climate scientists, talking to government, and looking at where the opportunities for win-wins are, but also where key gaps are. We heard this morning about cascading risks or compounding risks, and making sure that we avoid negative outcomes for sectors, for businesses, and for people. And critically important, we have the information we need to act now. The quality of the information may change slightly, but there's not going to be dramatic changes. We have a national climate change objective of realising a climate resilient Ireland by 2050 at the latest. That's 26 years. That's not long to recognise that ambition. The second part of the EPA summary for policymakers delves into each of these underlying reports in the chapters, in the underlying volume. So we looked at future impacts across 8 key sectors. And I can't go into each of these. I'll encourage you to look at the summary for policymakers and each of these different areas in detail in the chapter. But what is clear is that all aspects of Irish society, environment, and the economy is sensitive and exposed to climate change. For ecosystems, marine, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems, we have some really sensitive ecosystems here. Iconic things, peat bogs, for example. We have a growing but still limited understanding in terms of marine ecosystems, in terms of the blue economy for the future, and in terms of freshwater, changes in river flows, increases in temperature, and species, phenological changes, all very much dependent on future climate. For agriculture, forestry, and land use, the crops we grow, the timing of farming activities, the expansion that's happened, increased debt among farmers, increases vulnerability. There are multiple exposures across agriculture, forestry, and land use. Even thinking about 2018 drought and the impact on forestry, a lot of impacts, particularly in the east of Ireland. I want to focus in a moment on coastal environments. As an island nation, we have all of our major cities by the sea, also predominantly on the outlets of major rivers. A high proportion of Ireland's population live close to the sea. A lot of infrastructure, a lot of our tourist industry is exposed to what's happening at the coasts. We are seeing dramatic changes in our coastal environments, sea level rise that I'll touch upon in a moment. For water resources, again, thinking about our vulnerability, we had water restrictions in January this year in our capital city, urging people to conserve water because of a challenge in meeting demand. We have changes in low flows, critically important for water quality and discharges to water from agriculture, for industry, but for aquatic ecosystems. What should be becoming apparent here is how linked each individual system or sector is. We have the issues of flooding, which have been talked about, that I won't go into much more detail on. Our built environment, heritage, and rural communities, again, all really important in terms of building design, in terms of increased temperature, key for moderating indoor temperatures into the future, critical infrastructure, really important in terms of energy, water supply, health infrastructure. These are the areas where we're having crises in Ireland at the moment, and is it because of a lack of investment and a lack of long-term planning? For health and well-being, people have done a lot of work in terms of future changes in disease, future changes from impacts from extreme events like flood impacts or exposure to temperature extremes. But one of the things we draw attention to in this chapter are the issues of experiencing the impacts of climate change, like the impacts of loss of place on rural communities in coastal areas, loss of livelihoods, loss of nature, loss of places that people call home. There are a lot of issues in terms of mental health and well-being, in terms of dealing with ongoing change, but also in terms of avoiding negative impacts into the future. And in terms of business, tourism, and industry, we've heard about the exposure and the importance of insurance from the Governor of the Central Bank, but again, recognising the fact that we are an open economy, that we are also dependent on international reinsurance markets, and that our own national tourist industry is also a source of pressure on natural ecosystems, but also potentially a benefit in terms of future climate change. And it's balancing those threats and opportunities that will be so important to adaptation. I want to also recognise the fact that climate change does not stop in 2100, and this is a key issue for our coastal environments and for coastal change. These are projections of sea level rise globally out to 2300, and even under the best case scenario, net zero, RCP 2.6, we see sea level rise continue to increase over the next couple of hundred years, where we are already, with a best case scenario, baked into at least 1 metre sea level rise globally. No matter what we do with emission scenarios now. In terms of future greenhouse gas emissions, we still have a role to play in recognising or realising where we land in terms of these future changes in sea level, but climate change does not stop in 2100. On the right-hand side is a picture from my local area, Cortown in County Wexford, where even after the addition of rock armour to stop erosion here of a local forested area, you can see after storm events that erosion is continuing, trees falling, and a really important local amenity being lost. And again, working with students, we can see the changes that are happening and how rapid they are. This is again from North Wexford. It's an area further north called Kilpatrick, which is around the Castletown area in North Wexford. And this is work we did with the MSc Climate Change on a field course recently, looking at the current vegetation line and looking back at historical maps to look at how fast erosion is happening here. You can see the track from 1845 about up to present, and we're able to calculate the rate of retreat or loss of the beach here. We're seeing an average loss of land since about 1900 of about 229 metres. That's reaching up to 1/4 of a kilometre for this one area alone. And that rate of loss is increasing. So again, how do we support communities in responding to this kind of change? We're not going to be able to protect everywhere. If we look at sea level rise in this area of the world, in North Wexford and Cortown, we have long-term records. Since the mid-19th century, we've increased sea levels about in tandem with global mean sea level of about 0.2 of a metre so far. So my last few minutes, how do we go about realising a climate resilient Ireland? We are starting to make progress, but how do we step this up? And the report goes through things that we can do to do better adaptation. Thinking about defining our objectives of what we mean by resilience. What do we want to achieve in terms of individual projects and as an island as a whole? What does it mean to be resilient to climate change? I was delighted to hear this morning both the department and EPA talking about just adaptation and integrating issues about the process of adaptation and making sure everybody is involved. The burdens and outcomes and benefits of adaptation are equally distributed, and that the process that we engage to make decisions with communities is fair and represents diversity and voices that are important to listen to. We need to recognise that adaptation is not just one intervention, it's an iterative and ongoing process. It's going to take multiple interventions and sites and monitoring and evaluation of how things are playing out, whether we need to increase attention in certain areas, but also monitoring outcomes for people. Adaptation, again, has outcomes for people. They can be positive, that's the intention, but they can also be negative. And making sure that we avoid or minimise negative outcomes requires us to monitor and evaluate adaptation outcomes, to learn as we are doing. We need to do better at understanding the social dimensions of adaptation. We are quite good at doing the technical, whether it's flood walls or rock armoury, but how do we do better at understanding vulnerability, and how do we reduce vulnerability and increase adaptive capacity of people who are most at risk? And how do we work more with nature? We see a move towards increased nature-based approaches, but that needs investment now. Nature-based approaches take time to mature. If you're looking at coastal erosion in Kilpatrick Beach, for example, and want to plant particular species of dune grasses, they're going to need time to mature in order to be more effective in the future. We need to be doing this now. And we need to increase participation and cooperation. Justice in adaptation and resilience is about talking with local communities, developing and co-developing responses at that level. We need to learn to minimise maladaptation or response risk, and we need to recognise, as Hans Martin said this morning, these issues of cross-sectoral and cascading risks. My final set of findings from ICA then is tailoring climate services to need. Claire did an excellent job in terms of identifying how Met Éireann is tailoring the outputs from Translate to specific sectors. We need more of that, but also to move to communities. And we need to be able to integrate uncertainty into our decision making. Again, excellent examples of the kinds of decisions we take that are uncertain on a day-to-day basis, but taking account of principles like being flexible, avoiding pathways that lock in vulnerability into the future in decision making. And finally, invest in adaptation. We need to finance this. Scaling up adaptation requires an increase in investment. It requires the public sector, the private sector, government, local communities, all acting together, and for that to be facilitated. And we finished the report by looking at some key gaps in knowledge, but I'll not go into those right now. It's lunchtime. And just some acknowledgements to my other co-authors on Volume 3 and all of the other authors and the EPA involved in the ICA process. Thank you.
Conor, that was really, really fascinating. And I think both Conor and Claire have given a really good overview of just how the science and all the work on modelling and projections is underpinning and informing the national response to climate change. But we'd like to hear some questions both from the floor and from our online audience. So if you have a question for either of our panellists, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you as quickly as possible. And I might ask if you could just keep your questions brief, that would be great as well. We'll get through as many as possible. We've about 10 minutes. We're going to go till about 20 past. Dervla?
Yeah, so we have some online questions here. So one, how can we help people understand the fundamental impacts of climate change, the higher heat, more rain, storms, into what it means for people and economic sectors? And I'll do a second one as well. Just a general question about storms. What do we know about storms increasing or decreasing in Ireland?
Okay, so in terms of the first question and kind of communicating in a way that makes it real, I see you nodding. Conor, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, it's always the challenge, but I think we need to be consistent and we need to be drawing attention to the role of climate change. When we talk about extreme events, we can be pretty confident now that most extreme events are climate driven or have a signal or some component of climate change in them. So we need to be consistent in that communication. I was listening earlier on when Hans Martin mentioned deaths from extreme events in Europe. There was a little bit of an intake of breath. That's not surprising news. I mean, we've known this, but still the exposures seem to be underestimated, even among the audience here. That the kinds of things we could be looking at and we need to adapt to are quite significant. So it's communication, consistency, media. Well, that's a challenge in itself at the moment. Yeah.
Very good. And Claire?
Yeah, I agree with Conor. I think consistency in communication is absolutely essential. That's why it's important that kind of all the national organisations and research communities and organisations in Ireland work together to have a consistent and coherent method of communication. So it's essential that we're consistent in what we're saying, but then it's also essential that we communicate it effectively to the people that aren't climate scientists, so that we speak their language and that we work with them to understand their particular needs as well. So no longer doing things in that kind of silo, I'm a scientist anymore, I work on my own and I go down my rabbit hole, but working and engaging with those organisations and understanding their requirements and speaking their language to them.
And again, I suppose that requires that kind of collaborative and collective and cross-sectoral approach, which I think has come through in both of your talks very strongly. The second question around storms, did you take in the detail of the question?
Yeah. Are they increasing or decreasing?
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to say. I know that's not what people want to hear, but there is a high degree of variability when it comes to changing wind speeds in Ireland, and at the moment we just can't say whether or not they're increasing or decreasing in terms of of frequency or in intensity. We are doing active research on this to see in the Irish context what's happening. So hopefully in the next 12 months there will be kind of wind speed projections coming out of the Translate programme that might shed some light on that particular subject.
So no clear picture as yet, but watch this space.
Watch
Right,
this space.
okay. I think we'll take a couple of questions now from the floor, and I saw some hands earlier. So we'll get a microphone to you as quickly as we can.
Hello, I'm with the project Easy Treesy with Crown Trees for Ireland, and we've planted 500,000 trees with Ireland's children. So we'd like to invite you all to join this National Biodiversity Week starting on Friday, and invite you to join us by perhaps planting an apple tree, or very good for shelter from the wind, the rain, the whole country's in a drought. And we've space for 1 billion trees, which would still only bring us up to the level of Belgium at half the tree cover of Europe. So that is my invitation to you.
Thank you very much. Good to hear about that initiative, and we heard a lot about nature-based solutions, and planting trees definitely fits within that. I think there were some other hands.
Hello, Eric Conroy on Tashka. Given the fields with tillage and all the extra rain that we plan, are we going to have a huge food crisis in Ireland where we need to move away from beef and dairy to address climate change and produce more plant-based food? But we won't be able to produce it with all this rain. We're hearing about the potatoes, and just wondering, is there going to be a big issue piling up on us? Thanks.
Thanks very much. And Conor, I know you touched on that there, particularly in the winter and the spring that we've just had. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that future question, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not into agricultural models or crops or agricultural policy, but it shows us very clearly that we have a sensitivity to these kinds of extremes. You look back in terms of grass growth and the harsh winter or spring in 2018 and the impacts that had for farmers in terms of the economic hit, in terms of the impact on health and well-being. And again, with very wet conditions last autumn and the start of this year, it's showing a vulnerability and exposure. And that's why we need to do adaptation, is to look at, well, what are the crops that we need to do? How can we diversify? But that's farm-led, but it's also sectorally led, and that's why we need to do adaptation and step up our actions in adaptation.
Thanks, Conor. I think there's another hand there.
Hi there, Matt Hornsby from Department of Environment. It's kind of following on from the last question, but maybe more in a sort of technical sense. Obviously, agriculture and also land use is a major source of emissions for us, and that's probably going to get proportionally more significant as the years go on. And but that it strikes me that that's going to be affected a lot by changes in climate. For example, the effects of climate on peatlands, on forestry, perhaps on agricultural practices. So I'm wondering, I guess particularly within the EPA, is it feasible to kind of start factoring in, perhaps it's already being done, these projections on climate impacts into then our emissions projections going forward, taking into account in particular land use and land use change and agriculture?
I know there's a huge amount of work ongoing in terms of the emissions projections. It's not my own area. My colleagues here that would be able to speak to you perhaps over lunch if you'd like to follow up with them on that. Mary Frances Rochford is here, and I'm sure she'd be happy to speak to you in more detail on that. Just in terms of other questions for our speakers, Dervla, would you? Yeah.
I think this is a really important point, because our climate is changing, and over the next number of decades we're going to see a transformation in our landscape and land use. So we're going to have multiple drivers of change for things like water resources, water quality and flooding. And we hear a lot about the importance of climate models, but to understand what's driving those changes to make effective policy, we need to be able to disentangle what's driving what in terms of future changes in floods, for example, and that requires observations. It requires investing in our hydrometrics teams. It requires understanding and having good quality historical and future land use change data sets. So again, thinking of the future, there are multiple pressures. We're going to see more land use change, continued climate change, and others.
So that, again, that kind of joined up and integrated approach. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I see some hands.
Patrick David from Shankill Action for a Green Earth. Our interest is to try and assist our local population to understand the issues to do with climate change. The talks we've had have been absolutely fascinating and extremely valuable. But the language and the graphs are often incomprehensible to many, many people on the street. Now, the politicians are telling us that when they go on the doorsteps at the moment, they are faced with the obvious questions: housing, health, education, not climate change. So how do we break that and help them to understand that all these things depend on getting climate change right? Because if we don't, our society is going to be so messed up that we're going to have to redesign it almost from the bottom up. Are we looking for more journalists who are capable of telling a really good story and getting things down to the grassroots for people to understand really what's happening and integrate it into their own lives? Because I think we've heard that people understand that climate change is important, but not that it means that they are going to have to change their lifestyles, my lifestyle, your lifestyle today.
I might go to you, Claire. You've talked about the importance of communicating the information, so you might have some insights.
So firstly, it's a really good point, and I completely agree with you, because I personally struggle to kind of communicate climate change information across multiple audiences. I'm a trained scientist, and I'm trained to communicate in a scientific way. So to communicate to people not in the same field as me goes outside my area of expertise and my comfort zone. So I think that's not a problem that's just isolated to me. I think it's prevalent across most scientists. We tend to kind of burrow ourselves in books and facts and figures and stay there because that's where we're comfortable. One of the things that we're trying to do in Med Éireann, and where we're putting a lot of effort into this, is to understand how we can communicate with different audiences at the moment. And one of the things that we're looking at doing is creating climate storylines. Now, this is something that's been done kind of at an international level and has worked well in communities all across the world, where we situate climate change really within that local context, and we take events of meaning to people, and we look at how those events would look like under different climate warming scenarios. So we could look at a severe storm that had a huge impact for a local community such as Middleton, and push that out to, say, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees of global warming, and go, look, if nothing changes, this is what that storm could look like under climate change. And I know it doesn't solve it, or kind of solve that whole communication problem, but it does help situate the issue within that kind of human context and human memory, and that does help with the communication. So that's just one example of the types of things we're doing. But yeah, more has to be done in communicating to different audiences. I could not agree more with you in that. And again, that's about engaging with different disciplines as well. So working with social scientists, for example, who have expertise in talking across different audiences. So not staying in our own little silo.
I think we're almost at time, but I'll give the last word to Conor if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, maybe tell you next week I have to give a talk in Wexford with no slides and just a photograph. So I think that will be interesting. I agree, there's no one right answer, but it's being sensitive to needs. This is a particular audience, but going out into the public, working with communities, and being available, if asked to go to these things, to local communities, to information talks, and trying to be flexible and diverse, the kinds of things that we try to say we need to do to adapt. But yeah.
Very good. Well, I'd just like to, again, thank our speakers. Maybe we'll give them a round of applause. I found that really, really interesting, and I hope you did too. We're going to finish for lunch. We're asking everyone to be back for 2:30, and I believe lunch is outside and signposted. So thank you again.